Welcome to Talking Trash. Sandy Gunderson here, and Mr. Steve Skoog, the land use director, and we talked about 1970 to about 1990, 93, and we're going to continue that. So we have a couple questions regarding kind of landfills and what we do and why we do it.
Sure.
So when we have, did the old landfills have liners? Why were they leaking?
Well, if you go way back in time when they had the old landfills that the townships had, obviously those were probably selected based on convenience, and they were a lot of times as your local swamp or low area that they filled in and burned and capped. So obviously those were not a good thing. When the counties developed their own, or developed more of a regional landfill for garbage, at that time there was some engineering that went into it. Of course, they didn't have the experience and knowledge that we do now as far as how to manage those. The geology in Becker County here, out where our landfill was, it was that we had, there was 10 to 15 feet of clay topsoil, and below that it's all sugar sand with a flowing aquifer going underneath it. And so when they originally constructed the solid waste landfill here, they went down most areas. There probably was still some clay underneath it, but then they started breaking through that clay, and they were filling that granular area with garbage. Of course, then as moisture got put on there through the rain and whatever, it leached down through and got into that flowing aquifer, and so a plume developed. And at that point, when the contaminants started reaching neighboring properties and people started having problems with their wells, the county and the state realized we had a big problem. And so Becker County worked with the state of Minnesota to try to mitigate that and correct it as much as we could at that time. And the landfill was basically shut down. It was re-engineered, it was reconfigured, and then eventually the county turned the ownership of that, and the state took on the ownership along with the liability through the closed landfill program. It's part of the solid waste cleanup fund. That was back in 1994, and then following that, the county then started hauling all their waste to the Fargo landfill.
And so how was it different in Fargo? Did they had a lined landfill versus us?
They do. You know, again, when you look at the geology of the areas and you go into the Red River Valley, they probably got hundreds of feet of clay underneath them. And what's significant about clay is that it basically will tighten up and gets really hard, and it's almost impenetrable. The moisture won't go through it if you have the right type of liner. And in those areas they did, and here we did not. The county could have at that time, if they would have possibly decided to put a synthetic liner underneath it, but I'm sure that because of cost, the decision was made to outsource that elsewhere.
It seems like the 90s were really rocking and rolling in Becker County. I mean, we closed our landfill. We started an HHW program, or household hazardous waste, where we collect that. What else did we do? You
know, we did a lot of things, and you know, a lot of that started in the late 80s from the state leading the way and banning certain things from the waste stream. So when you start getting into the 1990s, the fluorescent bulbs were banned from landfilling. Now they're handled as special waste. There's a number of things that were banned. So you have fluorescent bulbs, you'd have appliances, motor oil, filters, motor oil filters, tires, demolition materials. They were banned earlier, but now that's really taking on a role. And then also yard waste was banned.
Why were they banned?
Well, you know, some of those materials are they're really not hazardous, or there's nothing really harmful about them, like yard waste. So we can handle those separately. Demolition material also, there's a lot of the demolition materials, as long as you remove the hazardous waste prior to being placed into a demo landfill, there's not a lot of hazardous material in that. So the thought was at the time is that rather than commingling this all with residential solid waste, that it's probably not that hazardous or dangerous. So therefore, you could have local landfills just for building materials. With that, they also in the 90s we started getting into planning more so on the local level. The county has had to start developing 5-year plans and then 10-year plans, and now they're probably 20-year plans almost.
Yeah.
So
We're moving. So the next show we'll talk more about the kind of the mid to the late 90s and all that's been happening. Thank you very much.